Hello, welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick n Pay, and welcome to the hottest culinary property in South Africa at the moment. This is Tang, a dark and alluring tribute to Pan-Asian cuisine put together by the fabulous Nicky van der Walt, and it's been absolutely jam-packed since it opened, which was about a week or two ago, so it's only just got going, but it's been getting rave reviews, and there are a number of reasons for that. The food is fantastic, the service is great, but most importantly, you get some rather nice wine here, and it is to that end that I'm celebrating with one of the icons, one of the aristocrats of South African wine, one of those Hemelen artists sorts who give us that Chardonnay and Pinot Noir that takes both South Africa and the world by storm. And so we're kicking off our morning in the perfect way, some of that Chardonnay, some of that Pinot Noir, with Mr. Anthony Hamilton Russell. Good morning.
It's great to see you, Dan.
A lovely way to start the day, and a lovely place to start the day in, because as well as being a superb restaurant with a lovely menu, there's a rather personal angle to this place, isn't there?
There is. Nicky and I have been friends for very many years, and we're incredibly proud of what he's done here. And I know he's been brewing for some years. He did start life very young as a restaurateur at a Prima Piatti that he had, and he's a natural. And the great thing is I'd like to believe our wines are here because the quality merits it, but I can also honestly say there's a bit of relationship involved.
Well, I think that works for both of you, because he's able to get hold of your wine, which is often quite difficult to get hold of, because it does tend to sell out rather quickly. And we've got some new vintages, which we're going to be celebrating today. Before we get into those, and before we get into a rather cool selection of wine, give me the Anthony Hamilton Russell food and wine story, because you are married to probably the best non-professional chef on the planet, whose cooking is celebrated all over the world. How important is that food-wine relationship to you?
Well, it's actually pretty important. I might be like you in that I think first about the wine and the food after that, which is probably a little bit wrong. But what appeals to us particularly about this place is if you had to choose one grape variety that matched a wide range of sort of maybe Asian-inspired or umami-rich food types, Pinot Noir would be that. And you know, on the lighter side, maybe some of the Chardonnay. So I do think that these grape varieties are a perfect match for this cuisine style. And at home, as you rightfully point out, I believe my wife Olive's a great cook. And we think very hard about what we have at the table, because we put so much effort into the wines. The last thing we want is to sort of dominate them. And actually, we don't open these that often at home. They're special occasion wines for us as well. We can't afford just to be drinking Hamilton Russell every day.
Well, I'm very happy that we are doing so today. There was some other wine that you showed me before you pulled out these two bottles, and what caught my eye was not just the bottle, but the label, which had some rather familiar looking art, and then a scrawled signature that I thought I recognized from some paintings I generally can't come close to affording.
That's absolutely right. It was some years ago, Michael Fridjon, who's known William Kentridge, I think, socially for quite a while. I've met him socially as well. And William Kentridge loves wine. And he was doing the backdrop for Mozart's Magic Flute, an opera production of that. And Michael, I think, put the idea to him of a number of wine producers purchasing as a monoprint some of those stage set prints and using them on a wine label, and the proceeds raised through that purchase of the monoprint went to putting on a production free of charge for various schools. So it was a charitable event. And we all got to get our monoprints, and we got to use a Kentridge label on our wine bottles, which is great. So I've got the 6 wines that Michael chose with William for that project over here with the hand-signed labels. And we're going to be having them at lunch with a group of our top customers. I need an excuse to drink them. They're 15 years plus now. Oh. So yeah.
I love that conjunction, because it brings together the art of making wine with art itself. And it's easy to talk about wine in very self-important terms and give it all sorts of attributes. But wine at its best really is a form of art.
I'd like to agree. I think, sometimes we would say craft, but I do think elevated to a certain level. I mean, some of the art is to do with the site and soil and how you manage that over a prolonged period of time. And then that winemaking follows on from that. And also the stylistic direction that you select and choose and maintain. All of those things come into, I think, great wine to me is it evokes an emotional response in a way that other product just simply doesn't. And as art does too.
And that's exactly what your wine has been doing for a long time. And in a moment, we'll have a crack at the new Chardonnay and the new Pinot Noir. But go back to the very start. Most people who drink wine, who drink South African wine, know of the Hamilton Russell brand. They've occasionally had it if they're lucky enough, and they've loved it when they have. But they might not know the backstory. What are the origins of the Hamilton Russell wine?
Well, it was a passion project of my father's. I think he'd worked very hard in an industry that he didn't like very much, advertising, for his entire career. And had done very well out of it and had the money to consider going wine farming, which is something he just would have loved to have done from the start. And it was the 70s, 1975. He managed to buy Hamilton Russell vineyards for 58,000 Rand, which we all wish we had been around then. We would have done similar things. But it was a very impoverished time in certain areas. And the other unique thing is he picked an area that had not been traditionally a wine growing area, had to overcome all kinds of legislative hurdles for the permission to make wine right near the southern tip at the time of Africa, overlooking the small seaside resort town of Hermanus and uncannily close to the sea. So for him, he stayed living in Johannesburg, would go down there for holidays, ran it from afar, and it was his passion project. He never intended, he would like to have made decent money out of it, but it wasn't the purpose. It was just pure about passion.
Where did the vision come from for these grapes in particular? Because now you talk about Amelinada and it's immediately, it's Burgundian, it's Pinot Noir, it's Chardonnay. But at that stage, not only was there not really wine there certainly wasn't Chardonnay and Pinot Noir.
Correct. And Chardonnay, in fact, the initial vines were, I call it creatively sourced, because smuggling sounds too illegal. But along with a number of other producers in South Africa, my father creatively sourced Chardonnay before it was available in the country and grew it up in our own nursery. And so we were one of the very first producers. But really the farm selected the grape varieties. The initial impetus to plant Pinot Noir in reasonably significant amounts as part of the mix of what was planted. I have to give credit to Dezo Pongratz, who has that Cup Classique named after him, a Hungarian viticulturalist who was something of a mentor to my father. And he was the one when my father drew a blank looking for a property in Stellenbosch. Marathi was not for sale, that's the one he wanted. He looked further afield under the guidance of Dezo Pongratz, who I gather was doing some research around the Bredasdorp area at the time for his employers. And Dezo was convinced that Pinot Noir would succeed. My father's initial passion, if I looked at what he collected as a child and the wines I shared with him, was really for Bordeaux. And that was part of the plan initially. From day one, from 1981, the first vintage, the Pinot Noir just sang. It just sort of stood up and said, guys, take me seriously, I'm the one. And then when Chardonnay was planted a couple of years after that, again, first vintage, it was very clear that it was Chardonnay and Pinot ground. Being hard times, South Africa was really sort of struggled through the latter days of apartheid. No exports really available in any significant quantities, if at all. Most producers tried to make something for everyone in a small local market. And I had the luxury, having taken over in 1991, of the export markets opening up. So I could think differently. I could say I'd rather do what we do best in a larger quantity for the whole world than try and do something for everyone locally. And I focused on these two only, and then was instrumental in, with the help of Dave Johnson, we pushed the government to create a situation where we could do the Amelinada appellations, with very much the focus being Pinot and Chardonnay. So we now have 22 producers in the area, some really beautiful Chardonnays and Pinots being made, whereas literally 30 years ago when I took over, we were the only people selling wine. Bushard Finlayson was about to start. And 4 of our ex-winemakers left us to make Pinot Noir and Chardonnay in the immediate area. So it was clear to everyone that this is what the Amelinada is about.
So many stories around South African wine involve a sense of vision and seeing something that few others did, and this is a wonderful example, and it leads into the latest vintages of both of these wines, which have such a storied past. We spoke about the Chardonnay a little while back on International Chardonnay Day,
yes.
But we get a chance to celebrate it again. A wine that, and I think you are in an appropriate position to make a scientific appraisal here, an excellent, if not breakfast wine, and certainly mid-morning wine.
Yes, 11s is, as I always say, it's essential to have a glass of wine. What I love about the 20 vintage, nature conspired to ripen grapes at lower alcohol. For us, certainly in our area, and I see it industry-wide as the wines come to market. And the yeasts, and we use our own indigenous yeasts, wild yeasts coming in off the vineyards, one we found in '93, that now is available to the world might be a new species called Sauvage. They're long, slow fermenters, and they're less effective at converting grape sugar to alcohol, and we like that about it. So this is under 13 alcohol, it's 12.9, and has the typical hard minerality that we associate with Hamilton Russell vineyards. And I know every time someone uses minerality, a wonderful comment from someone, what do they mean by minerality? And I saw the comment written underneath, they mean they don't know what else to say, which I love. But minerality to me is like a subtannin. It's a feeling rather than a flavor, and it's that sense of hardness and that a wine has a skeleton. It's not just a sort of a glob. It gives an electricity to a wine, and our Chardonnay is well known for that. And then, of course, that mild hint of reduction, that smell of a hard-boiled eggshell before it's cool enough to break away. Not quite the struck match character, but just that little hint of it, which we love.
This is, just double checking, your 2020. So it's still very, very on in its time. If you compare this to some of the older ones you've drunk, and I'm sure you've drunk your Chardonnay that goes back at least a decade or two, how much does the wine change? How much does it improve over that time?
I've never traditionally been such a big fan of aged white wine, and I'm changing that. I'm sort of almost maturing into understanding it properly. Some of the beautiful old Fine Tondonia, for example, the whites. We opened up in 89 about a week and a half ago, and I thought, and first in 88, and I loved it so much I opened up in 89, and for the winemaker too. It was the color of an old brandy, and that immediately puts me off, and you think something's got to be wrong. But then you taste the wine, it's absolutely beautiful, nutty, still alive, electric acidity. These wines by our people that collect Hamilton Russell, there are many that will think of opening our Chardonnay after about 10 or so years. They like that rich nuttiness that develops. You just got to get over the whole issue of color. And the French lectured me on that. Young French winemakers have worked harvests with us. We always taste really old wine with them. And I look at it and I say, well, that color's, really, and they say, oh, forget about it. If the wine is good, it doesn't matter. So this is our 39th vintage, because Chardonnay kicked in just a little after Pinot, and this is our 40th vintage. And it's something of a milestone for Hamilton Russell, the 40th vintage, and for me, my 30th. So.
All right, well, plenty of aging potential, but also a lovely blast of freshness as it is now. And as Anthony says now in South Africa, we shouldn't be looking at colour. Let's just go straight to the wine. This is the 39th, the 40th vintage is the Pinot Noir. So let's move from one Burgundian special to another. But as we do that, a question on that very assessment.
Sorry about that.
It's one I've had with a few producers from your part of the world over the last couple of years. My sense that the reliance on Burgundy as a benchmark, as a use of description, is becoming increasingly obsolete with Himmel-Länada, which is entirely able to stand on its own 2 feet in terms of this is wine on our own terms as opposed to
Yes.
the terms of somebody else.
Well, it's something I've grappled with philosophically in all of my 30 years. People tell us what they think of our wines in Burgundian terms. It's a useful aesthetic analogy. But obviously we're African, we're maritime, they're European, much further north than we are south, and they're continental. So there should be differences. We have the same kind of clay content as the Côte de Nuit. We have the same average maximum temperatures for our 4 hottest months, courtesy of that cold body of water. So there are geographic reasons for a stylistic sameness. But our identity should be distinctly South African. It is hard to articulate though, because in blind tastings, the top sommeliers, MSs in America, MWs in blind tastings are always calling this as a Burgundy. And it helps me to say this is a more Côte de Beaune style vintage than the more Côte de Nuit of the 18, just to get people's minds around it. But yes, we're not trying to bask in their glory or copy them in any way.
I think it's a great endorsement, it's a great accolade if that's what people are picking up. But we can very much claim it as our own rather than a facsimile.
Just on that point, Oliver's writing a Wesset diploma at the moment and wrote her big exam and did a tasting exam. She came up with a wine and she said, now that's a Hamilton Russell. It reminds me of our 18, and she didn't know whether to write that in, so she just said Walker Bay Pinot Noir to broaden it a bit out of Himmel-Länada if possible. And it turned out that was the Gevrey Chambertin, which they had put in the tasting. So
It's the kind of mistake you want to make.
Yes, but it's the first time someone's mistaken a Burgundy for a Hamilton Russell, not a Hamilton Russell for a Burgundy. So I was really happy about that.
Reasons to celebrate. All right, your latest vintage of the Pinot Noir. Talk us through it. Why is this another rock star to your fabled collection?
Well, the good thing about it is I was rather nervous about the vintage. Obviously, it's very young. Our wines are selling uncomfortably fast. Lockdown, as if anything, accelerated the rate that it's been demanded in our export markets because people are drinking more. We more than close to 50% sold through this already. The 21 is still in barrel. So the wine has unquestionably been well received and successful. My concerns were, if you remember, I said the 20 vintage, we got ripeness at quite low alcohol, and then the yeast conversion rate, sugars to alcohol, was particularly low. So this is only 12.8 alcohol, and it's very unusual for a 600 Rand retail South African wine. Generally, you turn the label around and you see if it's from Stellenbosch Paarl or somewhere like that. It's 14.5 on the label, which means rounded down from under 15 at some point. And this is a very gentle wine with a lightness of step. And coincidentally, almost symbolically, the analysis is almost identical to our very first vintage, 1981. And in the early 80s, the wines tended to be sort of a touch under 30 in alcohol wise. And you know, I love it. It came out like a newborn child. The parents are obviously really proud of it and want to show it to the world, but it's very young and you know, only just washed from hospital. They generally don't look their best. They need a day or two. But there's lots. I call it a more intellectual style because the fruit doesn't leap out. That's typically Hamilton Russell. It grows slowly and you search for it, but there are lots of spices and, you know, things like turned earth and the smell of iron and you know, something very, very spicy about the wine, which is a signature for us.
Well, the talk of food has me particularly peckish. On the downside, it is not Olive Hamilton Russell, chef extraordinaire, who's making something for me. But on the plus side, it is the kitchen at Tang, which is already getting rave reviews. Now to see if they're really worth it. Right, so the food has arrived, and this has been ordered by Anthony, whose palate is acclimatized to not just fine wine, but fine food as well. What have we got here, Mr. Hamilton Russell?
Well, there's the Peking duck, which I think the restaurant does particularly well, and that I think pairs beautifully with Pinot Noir. Mm-hmm. And then everyone loves blackened cod, and that I think the Chardonnay handles pretty well. So it's a nice, these are signature dishes for them, and they're signatures that happen to match our Pinot and Chardonnay fairly well.
I'm thinking that exactly as we're eating this, my wife is in the third hour of a board meeting.
Oh dear.
I think I'm having the better day.
Do you want to start with some Peking duck and we can
make up a plate?
This is generally a dish you don't wear a white pair of white trousers to enjoy.
All right. And then...
fingers have to be involved in this, I think.
So what I'm going to do, I'm going to have another little sip of the Pinot Noir just to remind myself. Oh, and even since you opened it, it's already just starting to express itself a little more and sing a little more loudly.
It's delicious. I skip breakfast just because every time before I eat here I want to be as hungry as possible.
I can see why.
Can I pass some of the blackened cod to you?
You may indeed. I think like you, I first had this from a gentleman by the name of Nobu.
Yes, same as me. I think, did he come up with it or is it a tradition that maybe?
The urban legend is that he did.
Yeah.
I'm not sure he has argued against that at all. Oh. All right. So this is your Chardonnay partner.
So this is one of the more slippery textured foods that has a way of eluding the chopsticks. So you obviously know your way around chopsticks better than me, Dan.
Oh, that butteriness to it. That lovely. I want to say oily. Oily makes it sound like it's kind of used car salesmanish. No, it's not. It just coats your palate so beautifully. And
it's very textural.
oh. And not dissimilar, but that was your dad having a vision, let's throw some Burgundian varietals into Hamiltonada. Here was a Japanese chef with South American influence who thought, this is how I'm going to do some cod. And she did, both your dad and Mr. Nobu get it absolutely right. Yep, those are fabulous. And for the sake of the filming, we're going to pretend that we're only just having a little taste of them, and then once the cameras aren't rolling, we're going to demolish the rest of them very excitedly. But as we pretend to end our meal, very quickly, give me a throw forward to the Hamilton Russell horizon.
You know, it's going to be more of the same. I was having a conversation with a producer in Barolo, Franco Massolino, brilliant property. And they're one of the ones that have gone back to some of the old tradition, but in a different way. So I call him a modern traditionalist. And I like to think of ourselves as that. If anything, we're likely to behave in a more traditional way, but with more technology behind it, with more experience behind it. But don't expect us to change from a single Pinot Noir and Chardonnay as a red and white wine expression of our monopole, our piece of ground. It's not all of the property that we farm to Pinot and Chardonnay, but Hamilton Russell only comes from 152 hectare piece of very clay red soil. So these happen to be Pinot and Chardonnay, but our best foot forward as a red and white expression of that particular site that we own. And I hope that carries on multi-generationally.
Well, I've been drinking your wine now for probably 2 decades
Thank
or
you.
thereabouts, and loving it for 2 decades or thereabouts. The new vintages simply continue that story, and together with the food, it's been a terrific experience, amplified by the company. But I have to say, I know Nicky van der Walt is a good friend of yours. These dishes are great, but I'm not sure if you can do it consistently, and so I think I'm going to have to come back tomorrow, and the day after that.
That's
and
what
maybe
we've
the day
been
after
doing.
that, just in case. This is Tang, Nicky van der Walt's brand new spot together with Leanne on Nelson Mandela Square in Johannesburg. Only just opened, already doing a roaring trade, producing some fabulous food. But if you want to get the best out of that food, do what you do with all good food in South Africa. Pair it with some lovely South African wine, and Hamilton Russell wouldn't be a bad selection. To join the Pick and Pay Wine Club, simply SMS your smart shopper number to 36775. It's absolutely free, and you'll get for yourself 3 times the smart shopper points on every bottle of wine bought. You'll also get a 20% discount on 10 different wines each month, a 25% discount on a case of wine, and a Magnum, some terrific competitions and invitations to awesome events.